Hello, and welcome to I Am Not For Everyone, the podcast for those looking to release shame, heal from trauma, and feel really, really good being their fully expressed, authentic selves. My name's Dr. Lee, and I am a doctorally prepared nurse practitioner and a certified clinical trauma professional, as well as a mom, wife, and a human being navigating the world with complex PTSD. Season 1 of this podcast came about because I was tired of spending decades living in a shame-filled, trauma-laden body and brain. And after doing a lot of work and learning how to return to a safe, grounded place in my life, I knew it was time for me to take my experience in education and use my voice to unsilence myself, to release the leftover shame, and to give others permission to do the same. On Season 2 of this podcast, I'm going to be sharing my experience in education. But even more importantly, I'm going to be bringing on some incredible guests who are going to unsilence themselves. They're going to share their own stories of trauma, shame, and their journeys to healing, resiliency, and self-acceptance. While I believe these episodes will be deeply impactful, I do want to add a disclaimer that we're going to be talking about some potentially triggering topics. So please take the invitation to pause or skip or fast forward on any episode, and to treat yourself gracefully and kindly after each time that you listen. Let's dive in. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode. I am really honored and jazzed to have my latest guest, Miss Kristin, on here with us today. Kristin is she's a client and also someone who's become a friend over the last several months and is doing some really, really groundbreaking, in my opinion, really impactful work in the world around stigma and around shame. And so I really wanted to have her on to share her story and to empower our listeners, because I think that there's a lot of listeners who are going to really resonate with your story, Kristin, and also learn a lot. So now that I've really hyped you up,
no pressure.
No pressure at all. I just know that this is how it's going to go, because Kristin and I have actually recorded a podcast episode on her podcast, which we'll give you the link to in the show notes. That was it was phenomenal. And so I just know that this is going to be great. So Kristin, please tell us all about you.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'm excited to be talking with you again, Lee. I love all of our conversations, but to be on your podcast, I'm super excited. So I officially introduce myself to people as the HSP and BPD Life Coach for women. So HSP is a highly sensitive person. So women who identify as being highly sensitive, or maybe they don't necessarily identify that as yet, but they've always known throughout their life, they have hypersensitivity, whether that is emotionally or physically. They may be very sensitive to coarse fabrics or loud noises, but then also be very sensitive in the way that they kind of just go about the world and perceive conversations. And then BPD is borderline personality disorder. And the reason that I lump these two together is because they're very related to one another. I think there's a lot of people who are highly sensitive and also have BPD. It's very closely related. So I work with women who have those sorts of challenges or just the way that they go through life, to really harness their emotional energy and protect it, balance it so that they can live the most fulfilling life and happiest life possible. Because when you're in these heightened sensitivity states, sometimes it can be very difficult to really find that balance and really kind of protect that emotional energy that you have.
We could do an entire episode on just the misunderstandings, the misconceptions, which you do an entire episode on this. So we'll just send people to your podcast, but on borderline personality disorder and on being a highly sensitive individual, you taught me so much, because the way that we are taught about borderline personality disorder, first of all, we're not even taught about highly sensitive people in, healthcare, in most healthcare, and is particularly in nursing education. And as far as borderline personality, I think we maybe got a few sentences on it, right, in our psych rotations. And the core message around it was one of shame. Is these clients, these patients are incredibly hard to deal with. Like, they're very manipulative, like a lot of really misconceptions. And so that was part of the reason why I've just been so drawn to your work too, is because you are very anti-shame focused and like clearing the misconceptions, clearing the misunderstandings, and really helping the people who have these diagnoses or who don't have the diagnoses, who are listening to what you're saying and going like, oh, wait, what? Like, do I have borderline? Am I a highly sensitive person? I think you do a really good job of helping people who don't have that diagnosis, who stumble onto your page for whatever reason, of being like, oh my gosh, like this is what I'm experiencing. This is so helpful. And you do it in like a really anti-shame, from an anti-shame perspective, which brings me to the point of our episode today. Like, tell us your story of shame that around this, that like really led you into this work.
Yeah. So, oh my gosh. Well, here's the thing with my story. I don't have one story of shame. I have like 5,000 stories of shame.
Facts.
So,
okay.
And yeah. And thinking about it, I'm like, what do I even want to tell? Because I have so many, and full disclosure, I am someone who was diagnosed with BPD. Mm-hmm. And I've always known throughout my life that I was a highly sensitive person, mainly because I was certainly told quite a lot that I was too sensitive. Mm-hmm. So once I got my diagnosis, it's like things just clicked for me. It was very much an eye-opening, like, oh, okay, that's why I respond that way. One, and two, you mean I'm not the only person in the world who feels like this, mm-hmm. which was just so comforting. So, in reflecting back and thinking about all the different times in my life, and there's actually a lot that I know I don't remember because there's years of my life I don't even remember because I think I've blocked out. But yeah, one of the very first stories that came to mind was I was in kindergarten, and I was always very, very shy, which is actually an HSP kind of symptom, I guess. They can be identified as being very shy. And so I didn't talk to a lot of people. I didn't have a lot of friends, but apparently, and I don't remember much about kindergarten, just that I didn't talk to a lot of people. There was this thing, I guess, where the kids in the cafeteria would try to take more than one straw for their milk. I don't know why. They just like to drink out of 2 or 3 straws at a time, whatever. Like, how old are you in kindergarten? 5? Yeah. 4 years old. So I remember there, and there was a lady who monitored this. And so, yeah, it was like a thing where, I could sneak and get an additional straw. And one day I came home and I told my mom, oh, I actually was able to get, like, I don't even remember the amount, but I know I at least got 2. I think I got 3 straws. And I'm like, and the cafeteria lady didn't see. And she was just like, oh, Kristin, that, and just that. And I didn't even remember what she said after that, but I just remember like she made it sound like it was the worst thing in the world. And so from that point on, it was like, oh my gosh, like I'm this horrible person. I stole 2 extra straws from the cafeteria at 5 years old. Right. And it's just funny how that has kind of followed throughout my life. A lot of times, I felt like I really had to hide parts of myself. And whenever they would really come out, a lot of times I was shamed for it. There was another incident when I was a teenager. I was either late years in high school or just into college. And we were at a family picnic. And my cousin gave me this little device. I think it looked like a lighter, like a Zippo lighter. And he's like, oh, here, can you light this for me? Well, it was actually designed to just give you a little shock. Instead, it wasn't really a lighter, right? It was like a gag, type thing. And I said, I don't even remember what I said. I said, damn it, or shit, or something like that. Now, granted, I was somewhere between 17, 19, right? And my mom overheard me and was like, oh, Kristin, I can't believe you just said that. It's like, okay, I wasn't like 9 and walking around like saying shit. I didn't drop an F-bomb. It wasn't like, so that was just a constant throughout my entire life. Anytime it was that it was that extreme reaction from her.
Yeah.
And I love my mother. I don't want any, it's like, she is a very good person. It's just, I think she did the best with what she had, with what she knew. Right. But I don't think she didn't realize how that affected me, having those sort of responses.
Yeah. Okay. So many things I want to tease out here. Thank you for sharing both of those, because I think that some people, when they hear examples like this, they're like, okay, Lee, you've had people on here that like have told stories about, grievous sexual assaults. You told people about like had people who are in cults, like all of these things. And your examples seem on the surface level, you're like, oh, these aren't a big thing. Right.
Right. And
there is something that I really want the listeners to hear, which is there are big, and we've talked about this in previous episodes, there are big T traumas and there are little T traumas. And people who have disorders of emotional regulation, people who have a lot of issues with shame and showing who they are as humans, it happens because most of the time, not because of these big, massive events that, these sledgehammer traumas, these big T traumas, it happens as a result of these little T traumas, these 1,000 tiny cuts, these paper cuts that happen over and over and over and over and all over your body, to the point that you're like, everything is sensitive, everything is sore, everything hurts. Please don't touch me. Right.
Yeah.
Let me figure out how to protect myself, because every time I show my primary caregivers or the loved ones around me parts of myself, I'm getting hurt. I'm getting shamed. And shame is one of those things that it's, like I said, it's insidious. And it seems like it's helping, right? Oh, I don't want my daughter to learn that it's okay to steal, right? Or to trick people. So let me use shame as a way to make her feel bad for this so she doesn't do it again. And that unfortunately just doesn't have the desired effect that we hope it will.
Yeah.
Right. In fact, it has the opposite in most situations. Is people, a lot of times these people will still continue doing what they're doing. They're just going to A, feel horrible about it, and B, they're not going to tell you about it. They're going to hide it.
Yeah. Which was exactly the thing with me. And the funny thing is, funny as in ironic, not funny, but is like, my husband and I had this debate where technically, okay, when I was a teenager, I was raped, but it was oral. So it was being forced to perform oral sex. And so technically that's rape. I didn't identify it as rape. Right. But that story, I can't say that I really had shame around. And so it's funny because I know other people would, but for me, it wasn't really a shamey thing. Now, granted, I didn't tell anybody, but I was just like, whatever, it is what it is. It happens. But I think at that point, I'd gotten to that point in my life where things like that, I didn't feel shame around, because my entire life up to that, I was shamed for basically being who I was. Or feeling, having the sort of reactions that I did. So I believed at my core, essentially, that, and that's where it goes back to self-worth issues, which is another thing with borderline, is a lot of people have self-worth issues and feel like they're not important. They don't matter. And that's why, because at least in my opinion, because they've had all of these things, these little teeny things throughout their life telling them, well, that's not okay for you to be like that. Or you are too sensitive. Why are you reacting like that? Oh my gosh, how dare you steal some straws? Like, instead of saying, well, I understand that, that's what the kids are doing, but it's really not a good thing to, take additional straws, and that's blah, 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 like going into the whole. Yeah. Like providing nurturing as you're giving limits and guidance. Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. So it's just funny. I think about some of the big, and, you had me make that list up of like the 50 experiences. Oh, I was so mean to you right at the beginning of, okay. So for our listeners, right at the beginning of us working together,
Kristin was sitting here trying to tell me that like she didn't have it, like relatable experiences, or like she hadn't overcome a lot of things. Like her story wasn't special. And I was like, okay, great. Give me 50 things that you've overcome, like 50 notable things that you've done, 50 things that you're like proud of that like other people haven't done. And this woman, who I did not know super well at that time, we had just started working together, gives me this list, and I will let you share this.
Oh, I mean, I honestly, I'd have to go back and look at what was on it, but I posted the list and I said, okay, here's my homework, which by the way, I did not perceive it as being mean, but I posted
I'm
my
joking.
homework.
Like I'm like making y'all do things that you're like, oh, but like, that's kind of the point of coaching, is working through that resistance.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I posted it and I remember I said something along the lines of, I mean, here's my list, but the thing is I don't think it's any, like, this is just life, Lee. Like there's nothing significant in it. Right.
And I read that list and I was like, what?
Yeah. I mean, I did balance it out. I tried to balance it out with some good things on there. Like they weren't all bad, but
no, but not even that. It wasn't the reflection on my end wasn't some of this is good or like a lot of this is bad. It was, this woman has gone through so much, like good and bad. And also like, we can't even put that label on some of the things that she went through because they were like good and bad or not good or bad. Mm-hmm. But just like the amount of like trials and stress, right? Because like stress can be good and stress can be, we can go through good things that are stressful and go through bad things that are stressful. The amount of stress that you had in your life was really notable.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny, even with you saying that, like, to me, I still feel like everybody can only identify with their own experiences or come from that place. Right. And so being that I didn't talk about all that with any one individual, I think too, not understanding kind of the gravity of everything that I'd gone through. And also that, I just look at it as like, oh, well, this is, everybody goes through shit. So, this is just my shit that I went through. And it still is kind of hard for me to wrap my head around it being like a whole lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Sort of thing.
Well, I actually have a question for you because I don't know the answer to this. You work with way more individuals with who are highly sensitive and or have borderline personality. Is that a common theme that you see where people are like, oh, like I haven't really been through that much, right? Like, yeah, like I got this diagnosis, but I haven't really been through that much. And then like, as you start teasing it out, you're like, okay, but like, or like, oh, I don't have that much trauma. And then you look through it and you're like, okay, but like, what about this? And what about this? And what about this? And what about this?
That's a good question. And I would say up to this point, no, it's probably not a common theme.
Yeah.
From what I've seen, because people will talk about stuff that they've been through, certainly, but not with the, I mean, it just is what it is sort of type of mentality. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's kind of a little bit of a revelation for me. I don't know how I got to that point of, oh, well, it is what it is. I mean, certainly when I'm in the thick of it, it doesn't feel like that. But then I was also made to feel shame when I struggled with my mental health as a teenager. Uh-huh. And I would tell my mom I was depressed and I got, oh my gosh, you just have such a horrible life, don't you? Like it was, and so I think that's maybe that's why I kind of take that stance of, I mean, everybody just goes through crap sort of thing.
I think what you're speaking to is actually something that a lot of people who experience shame from primary caregivers also experience, which is gaslighting.
Yeah.
And gaslighting, for those of you who aren't familiar with that term, I feel like it's gotten very popular in the last few years, but
yeah, it has.
And it's used not in the right way. Often gaslighting is basically where the experience that you are having when you convey that experience, when you express your understanding of that experience to other people, they're like, that's not what's happening. That's not the facts. You're overreacting. In fact, you're talking about me causing the problem. You're actually the one causing the problem. And here's how, and I'm going to list out that evidence. And by the time you are done explaining or processing externally what you went through, the person on the other end has changed your reality, right? Has basically said your version of reality is not the reality. And here's the actual correct version of reality. And oh, by the way, this is your fault, not mine.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so oh my gosh, because you just have such a horrible life. Well, first of all, I hear two things happening in that. One, it's downplaying how you're actually feeling. And two, my thing, as if I heard that as a teenager, would be to be like, okay, but like, I guess I don't really have that horrible of a life. So like, maybe I'm just like making too much out of this.
Yep. Which is exactly what I would do reaction wise. Like, and okay, then, fine.
Yeah. But then also like, there's another part of you that's like, but wait, like, cause okay, great that all that happened, but like, I'm still over here feeling depressed. So like, so that even is a deeper layer of shame, right? It's you shouldn't be having the feelings that you're having. And by the way, the feelings that you're having are your fault.
Yeah. 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 So, and I think that's a really good point too, because it's just even thinking about, like other guests that you've had on where they have these big incidences in their life that they can attribute shame to. I mean, that's why, like, my entire life up until probably the last couple of years, it was like, oh, I was just a shameful person. I was just even though I know consciously, like I'm not, but at my core, that's what I would feel like. So even though it's not this big story of trauma, it's still this, like, that's how I identify myself. That was, that is one of my personality, like, I don't want to say my personality factors or traits, but that's essentially the underlining. Yeah, exactly.
It feels like shame, that you are a shameful person, which let's talk about that. You didn't say I am a person, like a shameful person is someone that should be ashamed of themselves. The word itself means I'm filled with shame. And that's true. You are filled with shame. And the shame that you are filled with is coming from an external source. And yet the way that you are identifying with it is, no, I am the person who perpetuates the shame. The shame is my fault. This is part of who I am at the core. And I think that, like, if we can understand that as being part of complex PTSD or borderline personality disorder, that fundamentally shifts how we view people with that disorder.
Yeah.
Because of course they're going to do some things that you're like, what are you doing? Why are you responding that way? What is going on here? If somebody feels like they are a shameful person.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm just thinking about some of the stories that I've even heard from people with BPD too. And I think that, like, that really is an underlying theme for people with BPD. Mm-hmm. They may not outwardly come out and say, oh, I felt shame around this, but in the stories that I hear and the stories that I've seen in the various BPD groups that I'm in, like, that is it. Like, they feel like they're a terrible person because they have these big emotions. They don't know how to regulate these big emotions. So they do these things, lash out at people, or split, which is, oh, I'm happy one moment and I'm devastated the next, or I'm angry the next, sort of thing. And then say, oh, I'm a horrible person for this type of stuff. But it's because they've had that underlying theme of, hey, you're a horrible person since you were essentially born.
Right.
I mean, maybe not all of them. Obviously, that's an assumption, but that's just the pattern I've seen.
No, I think that you're really hitting you're hitting the nail on the head here, and as somebody who has less experience with borderline and more experience with complex PTSD, that is where the overlap in those two diagnoses occur. Is the shame piece, is the 1,000 tiny cuts. We've had lots of complex, chronic, small, and with complex PTSD, a lot of times they are bigger, intrusive. So like when you think of complex PTSD versus borderline. Borderline a lot of times is more of, we talked about the three things that you need as a child is limits, guidance, and nurturing. BPD oftentimes is the nurturing isn't there. And the needs or the limits and the guidance and the nurturing are participated in a more neglectful way or a more avoidant way or a more abandonment focused way. Versus complex PTSD, a lot of times it's more intrusive, where those limits and guidance and nurturing, the boundaries around that get violated often. And so it's not that there's neglect, it's that there's actually more intensity around those things. And so, but I think that this is so fascinating. And I know I'm like going off on a tangent, but I think it's an important one. I think this is so fascinating because that's where the overlap of these two diagnoses occur. And these are the two most shame-focused mental health diagnoses that you can have.
Yeah. Well, and I actually appreciate your explanation too, because so I got into DBT therapy. I did it for about a year. Really, the facility I went to recommends 2 years, but I ended up having to move to Florida for a job that I was taking. And so in my therapy, there were two different aspects. There was a personal therapy aspect, and then there was a group therapy aspect. And so in group, you work on skills, and in like the private, you work on kind of triggers and things like that. And I even remember my therapist saying to me during my private session, you know, once we kind of get a handle on, because I had some suicidal ideation type stuff, right? So once I get a handle on what my triggers are for that and what leads me to those suicidal thoughts and really feel like we get to a good place, then we can work on the trauma. And I even remember saying that, and I was thinking, I don't have any trauma. What trauma do I have? I don't have any trauma. And unfortunately, I ended up leaving to move states before I could get into that with her. But a lot of people with borderline are also have complex PTSD.
Oh yeah.
There's very much a crossover, not all of them, but yeah, I think I want to say the statistic, they estimate like 80%.
It makes total sense, right?
Yeah. But I never knew the distinction between the two because I didn't get into it with her. So I had looked up on my own, and one of the things, because I absolutely hate the term borderline personality. I hate it. It's a horrible, like in and of itself, I think it's stigmatizing. And I think I was on like verywellmind.com or whatever. I think that was the website I was on. And they were talking about how they considered renaming borderline. And one of the things they considered renaming it to was complex PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was actually the first time I'd heard that was complex PTSD. I was like, oh, interesting. So then I started looking at that a little bit more, but I never knew what the distinction was between the two.
Well, and I'll be fair, like this is my interpretation of the distinction between the two. There might be another shame expert that comes along or mental health expert that comes along and says, you know, no, that's not it. And from the experience I've had with both personally and professionally, this has been the best way that when I then talk about it to clients, they're like, yes, like that is the thing. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of people with complex PTSD, yes, a lot of them do have abandonment experiences in their past, neglect experiences in their past. And those people who have complex PTSD with those experiences tend to also have borderline as well. And I think that we're having a conversation about the fact that just a lot of how we have defined and named and classified these things is shameful and stigmatizing and is not trauma informed. And I am really excited that there are people like you out there that, you know, what is the name of your podcast?
Breaking the borderline stigma.
Yeah, it's so good, right? I think it's really helpful that there are people out there now that are starting to do the work of really looking at like, okay, yeah, great. From a traditional medical psychotherapy model, like these are the way that we've named things and these are the things that we've done. And like, also, is this causing harm?
Yeah.
they didn't want to even put complex PTSD into the DSM for like a really long time. And in fact, I have to look because at last I was listening to something. I believe that they have put it in the DSM now. I know that they've put it in the ICD-11 codes, which are the billing codes that therapists and mental health professionals use. But if you listen to Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's book, Around the Body Keeps Score, he actually talks about this, of like how they have had this massive fight in the psychotherapy realm to get some of these diagnoses in. And even now, if you read the diagnoses for PTSD, the diagnostic criteria, there are a lot of people in, the shame and the trauma-informed worlds that are like, that definition is not comprehensive enough. Yeah. It's very limiting.
Well, and the funny thing is because I went through that book too, and he talks about that complex PTSD in the same section where he's talking about BPD, because he says, he's like, a lot of people get diagnosed with BPD because they actually can't be diagnosed with complex PTSD. So, so it may be an overdiagnosis sort of thing, but that part I very much paid attention to, because it's like, oh, he's talking about BPD. I'm going to like really focus on this now.
Which is so funny, because I remember him talking about the complex PTSD part and not the BPD part. Because I was like, ooh, complex PTSD, tell me more. Right. Yeah. So funny what our brains focus on, which is a really interesting point there. So let me, please go ahead.
So I was just going to say, from a shame aspect, it's interesting because I remember when I got my diagnosis, like, it's not something I wanted to share with people. I actually didn't even start sharing it until we started working together, because I wasn't at the point. So I was diagnosed in 2017. Yeah, no, take that back. 2018, I was diagnosed. And I talked to my boss at the time after I'd gotten my diagnosis, but I didn't want to tell her what it was. I just was trying to explain. There's this whole story of shame around that too. It was like, oh, I wasn't interacting with the team enough. And I know that there was one individual on the team who was essentially basically like, does Kristin like us? Even though every morning I would come in and say hi, I would still turn around and talk to them all the time. There was just this perception. But I think it was more of I don't like her because she doesn't interact as much as I want, as I expect her to. So I was basically trying to explain to my boss, like, okay, like having this conversation. And I told her, I said, I do have a disorder. And I essentially said, it's kind of like essentially trauma, like being diagnosed with, PTSD. And she kind of chuckled. She's like, except you haven't gone to war. And I said, yeah. And because I had talked to my therapist at the time, and this was even before I got diagnosed with BPD, but I had told him, I said, I sometimes I feel like I have some PTSD, even though it's like, I don't know where it would come from. I've never had this big T trauma. Right. Although you might be able to argue that, but
you did, but you hadn't labeled it as that. Yes.
Yeah. And he even told me, he's like, well, I think that, I think you kind of joke about it, but I think there's there's some truth to that. And so all of these, happenings and encounters, like, led me to think, okay, that's something I'm comfortable sharing, because I was not comfortable sharing that I was diagnosed with BPD, but I was comfortable saying, look, I have some like trauma PTSD type symptoms type of thing, to try and help explain, because I was essentially being shamed into, hey, you're not interacting enough, sort of thing. And it's like, okay, I'm here to do a job and I have 2 kids. Like, I like you guys, but to be honest, like, I could give a flying fuck whether or not I sit here and talk to you all day. I want to get my job done and go home to my kids.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, so it's like, I'm sorry if I'm not feeding your ego enough for it. Like, oh, even though it was strange to me, because I'm like, I talk just as much as the chick next to me.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, so yeah, it's like, I mean, that's kind of another shame piece aspect to it too. I felt more comfortable saying, okay, look, I have like kind of a form of PTSD. But I hadn't heard the term complex PTSD yet. But she even chuckling to it, like, oh, except you haven't been to war.
You haven't been to war. Or you like haven't had, you haven't been in a car accident. You haven't like had a sudden loss or death. And like, that's when you look at the DSM diagnosis, I don't have it right in front of me. So like, don't direct quote me all, but like, it talks about a serious life, like a serious real or perceived life-threatening injury or experience. And what we're actually finding is that what our bodies perceive as life-threatening versus what we have societally defined as life-threatening is different.
Yeah.
And as a 4-year-old child, having a parent, scream at you, or having a, right in front of your face or physically hurt you, having a primary caregiver when you are crying and asking for help, turn their back to you and, go and take care of their own needs and leave you there. Like, are those technically life-threatening events? No. Do they feel life-threatening? Absolutely. And one of the things that, his name is Robert Scarce, I believe. I have the book right here. Robert Scare, sorry. Scaer. He talks about we really need to add in a feeling of helplessness to the definition of trauma.
Yeah.
And PTSD is because it's when we feel helpless. It's when we don't feel like we have agency. And by the way, the adoption of the belief it is what it is chronic helplessness.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That is an adaptation that you took on of like, I'm going to accept the fact that I'm helpless here because like I'm too tired to fight. And every time I fight, I get shut down.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to accept that the things that happen to me. And I see this a lot in people who end up in serial abusive or emotionally unstable relationships. I see this a lot in people who have, struggle with addictive tendencies. I see this a lot with people who are homeless, this idea of learned helplessness. And so often as a society, we're like, well, what's wrong with these people? Why can't they just like pull themselves out of this? And like, they've got agency and they've got control. And like, in reality, do they have agency and control? Absolutely. Do they believe they have agency and control? No.
Yeah, that kind of hits the nail on the head too, because I don't want to say prior to, and part of like the whole journey of how I kind of got out of this, and I'm not 100% out of it because I still have these stories that I'm kind of peeling back. Right. But was, one, getting into therapy and getting the right diagnosis and then starting to learn those skills. And then also starting my business and having that vision of what I wanted my life to be like, because it gave me something else to work towards. And I am a problem solver. So it's like, okay, how do I solve this problem? How do I change it? How do I make it better? That sort of thing. That's a very simplistic view, but that's essentially like what kind of started to propel me forward and get myself out of sort of victim mode. Because as much as I didn't want to look at it as that, there was very much that victim mentality. I hate the word victim mentality. Honestly, I hate that like phrase because it makes it sound like you consciously are choosing that, which I don't think you are. But it's because I had the underlying belief of, you can't change anything sort of thing. And so many people have that underlying belief. So it all goes back to mindset, but it's like, because I feel like people operate their life from a place of fear than a place of possibility. Yeah. And that's what we're taught in society, essentially. Like, oh my gosh, yes. So, we've like layered the American dream on top of like these systemic societal belief, like very strong beliefs of scarcity and never enoughness and toxic productivity and all of these things. And so people are like, I feel like I should be able to do this. And also like, I can't, like and going back to what you said about victim mentality, I think that this is really huge is because here's the thing is when I look at people, I'm like, I am always going to see the sovereignty in you and I'm going to honor the victim in you because like, I fully believe that you have the capacity and the power within you to claim your agency and to be able to do some really amazing things. And I'm also going to honor the fact that you've likely had a lot of life experiences that have told you the exact opposite. Yeah. And so like it gets to be a both and I used to, before I was trauma informed, the way that I did my coaching was a little traumatic because I was like,
are you going to stay in victim mode or are you going to take responsibility? And I have really, the interesting thing that I've found is when I coach people and I'm like, dude, let's stay in victim mode for a minute. Let's get mad about all the things that have happened to us. Let's really let ourselves feel that. Cause I think, because oftentimes there's shame wrapped up in the victim mentality, right? Yeah. When we remove the shame from it and we're like, no, let's just honor the fact that we have been a victim. Look at all of these places that people took advantage of us and we were helpless. And when you can stay there for a little bit and actually allow yourself to not make yourself wrong for it, that's actually when I see people starting to take back control and starting to claim their agency. Is they're like, oh, okay, the shame was actually the problem. And if that's not here, then I can move forward.
Well, yeah. And I think the underlying thing, so the biggest thing is for me, I fully believe that if you want to live a happier life, you need to learn how to process and regulate your emotions. Emotion management is the key to everything. That's it. We're not taught how to manage our emotions. We're taught to ignore our emotions and stuff them down. So that's not emotion management. It just comes back some other way.
No, that's emotional. Yeah. That's an emotional avoidance, right? Yes. Okay. So I love the direction this podcast went. It's not where I thought we were going to go at all. And it's gorgeous and beautiful. And I really want to give in these last few minutes, I want you to share with the audience, talking about this emotional management piece, because BPD is an emotional dysregulation or emotional regulation disorder, right? Yep. What is your life like now that you said you got your diagnosis in 2017, having starting really working through doing the work of emotional regulation? What is your life like now? What has changed? What looks different?
Oh, I mean, it's a total 180. It's a total 180. Prior to getting diagnosed and starting to learn the techniques. And by the way, some of the techniques were simple, but they weren't happening in the sense of even recognizing when I was feeling anger. I knew I was angry, but I wasn't actually naming it. We don't really name our emotions. And part of understanding them is naming them. So going through those processes, prior to that, I essentially was a miserable human being on the inside. I didn't show it externally, but on the inside, I was dying inside. It was pretty much okay, when's the next disaster going to happen? When's the next thing that I have to get through? And now I just see the possibilities for what my life can be and what it will be that I'm working for it to be, working towards. So it's completely changed my viewpoint on things. I now take more of that positive viewpoint of, okay, well, how can I problem solve, or how can I, after, of course, whatever the situation is. So for an example being, not just letting things happen to me. Okay, something happened, go through, process the information, whatever. But then now how can I make that better? As opposed to, okay, something happened to me. When's the next thing going to happen?
Yeah. You went from a state of hypervigilance and helplessness to a state of awareness and responsibility.
Yeah.
Gosh, that's gorgeous.
And I don't wake up every day hating my life, because I pretty much did. Even though I loved my kids, I would wake up ugh.
Yeah. This sucks. I feel like shit. I see all the reasons around me that I should be happy and I'm not. Yep. What is this? To, I'm actually feeling my feelings and experiencing life in the moment, and not using the past to process what's currently happening. And okay, I actually can enjoy the things that are good.
Yeah. And actually feeling empowered to change what I feel like I need to change, or work towards what I want to work towards. Gorgeous. As opposed to having a defeatist mentality of, well, that's what I want, but it's never going to happen.
Yeah.
I can't make that happen, sort of thing.
Okay. So, and this is I just want to really nail and drive this point home for the people who are listening. This is literally what Kristin helps you do too.
Yeah.
If you have these diagnoses,
Mm-hmm.
or if you think you might have these diagnoses, because trust me, if you feel like you might have them, if you feel like you have a lot of trouble regulating your emotions, you feel like an emotionally labile person, guess what? You fit into this category, whether you have the diagnosis or not. And learning emotional regulation techniques will help you.
Yeah. I mean,
Okay.
really, the diagnosis, I think, is irrelevant. The only thing is it helps you understand where you came from.
Exactly.
But if you feel like you are basically living a life of constant misery, I mean, that's what I help people get out of.
So good.
Turn it into a life that you actually enjoy and you are excited about.
Yeah. Okay. So if there are people listening, first of all, we'll drop Kristin's information in the show notes. So if you want to connect with her, you offer free discovery calls for people to just like chat through this stuff, right? Okay.
Yep.
So we'll make sure all that's in the show notes. And then the last thing I ask everyone, and I'm excited to hear your answer, is what's one piece of advice that you would give our listeners who feel like, okay, maybe I'm an empath. I'm a highly sensitive person. I have some difficulties regulating my emotion. Your childhood sounded a lot like mine. There's so much shame everywhere. I feel like I'm a shameful person. What's one piece of advice that you would give that human who's resonating with this? I know.
Yeah. I don't know if I could boil it down to one thing.
It's okay. Give us what you got.
I think the one piece of advice would be, you are not alone. No matter how alone you feel, you are not alone. There are people out there who have similar experiences and can very much relate to what you are going through and what you have been through.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't have to live in that story for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
You do have the power to change it, and you do have the power to discover the right steps that you need to take. And you also have give yourself the grace to know that it is an iterative process. It is steps. It's not going to happen overnight. And that's okay, because you didn't get like that overnight. Things didn't happen to you overnight. So
18 years of shame, or, I'm just thinking of the childhood years alone, 18 years of shame. It's not going to take like 18 days to undo that.
Yeah.
That's really, really helpful. Okay. Thank you so much, my dear, for coming on here.
Thank you.
Thoroughly enjoy having conversations with you. You're so brilliant and, I love everything you share. So, okay. We will share Kristin's podcast also in the show notes if you want to go listen to more of her, because you should. And, you don't have to do anything. You shouldn't do anything. But like, in my opinion, if you enjoyed this, you should go listen, because you'll enjoy it more. And thank you again for coming on.
Thank you. And I apologize if I derailed the conversation away at all.
Oh, no, you know me. I am somebody that's like, whatever direction the conversation is going to go is the direction the conversation is supposed to go. That's and that's the best part of having your own podcast, is you make the rules. There are no rules. We get to talk about what we want to talk about. So thanks for coming on. Thank you to everyone who is listening, and we will see you next week. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you're interested in learning more about how you can help yourself and others release shame, heal from trauma, and create healthier, safer, more mutually beneficial relationships, I want to invite you to head to our website, institutefortrauma.com. At institutefortrauma.com, you'll find free resources, be able to connect to our free online community, and view our courses and trainings, including our foundational trauma-informed, psychologically safe certification, aka the TRIP certification. Head to institutefortrauma.com today to learn more.